Hi, everybody. This is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and I'm answering questions. So Simpson Bergman asked me a question. I may have answered this, and actually from some comments I got, may have answered it incorrectly by misunderstanding his question. So I'm going to re-answer it based on my reading of this. So he said, thanks for your input on my question. I have another one. What I'm finding is that no single time delay gives a great match between the two impulse responses. Due to the duration of the impulse response, I can set the relative delay so that the first half of the impulse response matches very well, but the second half of the impulse response does not. He's looking at the impulse responses at particular frequencies. I understand that this implies a need for more involved filters, like all-pass filters. Do you have an opinion on Dirac bass control for this? He goes on basically to say that Dirac with bass control is not available on the Mini DSP Flex, and so he's looking to use Dirac with bass controls, the PC software, and actually use that as his playback. And he then later asks, he says, I watched again your video on top automated EQ for multiple subwoofers where you talked about Dirac Live with bass control. So he's going to get a 4-channel DAC and try it. So I'm going to re-answer this. First off, when I do my beta testing, I use the PC software. So I think the PC software is fine. It works fine. It actually has typically expanded capabilities. The beta softwares don't. They're often more limited just because they're beta. But the PC software can do like up to 192 kilohertz sampling rate, whereas most of the processors and receivers are restricted to 48 kilohertz. So if you care about that stuff, and I do actually think that all else being equal, it's worth having the higher sampling rate. There is, this is controversial, but there is actually research that shows that that is audible. It's just subtle. And the research is not one study. It was a meta-analysis. So I look at that as it's probably worth having than not. Even if the rest of the system isn't capable of reproducing that, like even if your tweeters don't go beyond, let's say 25 kilohertz, doesn't really matter because I suspect that it's the effect of the filters that's audible and not the rest. Okay, so tangent. As for bass control, there's been some comments that I really think they're misguided. And I think that if you were to take the time to read the various studies, and probably the best thing to look at would be Todd Welty's work on this, and then look, like, if you're not understanding it, don't just assume that it's unimportant, because I think that might be some of what's going on, is that some of what he gets into is fairly technical. And so I think people are ignoring some of that. The other one is go look at Multi-Sub Optimizer. He references the source material he used to develop Multi-Sub Optimizer. The two of those is going to be a good place to get the research articles you need in order to understand this. But basically, neither of those softwares, the sound field management developed by Todd Welty for Harman and the Multi-Sub Optimizer, are simply doing EQ, phase delay, and levels on a global basis. Like, it's not just time aligning the subwoofers, which you could do manually, and then applying global EQ. And Dirac with bass control, Dirac Live with bass control, is related conceptually in its implementation to the Multi-Sub Optimizer and sound field management. So all of them use what's often referred to as a brute force approach. What that means is that they don't have a elegant means by which to calculate an optimal result. So instead, what they do is using an algorithm with a set of stop points that are put into it around certain variables, it simply iterates. It simply calculates different EQs and phase delays and levels for each subwoofer in order to arrive at an optimal result. And I'm not going to pretend to fully understand how it works because I don't exactly understand what that looks like. I think the guy that developed sound field management has a pretty solid understanding and has probably posted quite a bit over on AVS Forum and others, and probably would be happy to explain better. But the essence of it, as I understand it, is that it's iterating over and over again until it hits a result. So one way to look at it is that you would put in a set of stop points based on things like how correctly it tracks a certain target frequency response. So you don't want the response to go up and down too much, right? We don't want too many peaks and troughs. And so you can apply some EQ there to get it to track that better. But there's something else you don't want either. You don't want it to deviate in the different microphone positions. Now, the software doesn't know where you put the microphone. It just knows that you put in a bunch of measurements that happen to represent different spatial positions. You may say, well, I've only got one seat, so all I care about is this one seat. You still, with these softwares, would want to have multiple mic positions. You just would probably keep them closer together. So somewhere within this area instead of going out to these other seats. So you optimize for these different seats. The software then is going to sit there and iterate through the results until it minimizes the variance between seats, the amount of variance in the frequency response from some null point, some 0 point, like the target would be, as well as the integration with the mains. And so again, it's going to look at that, the time alignment, the phase alignment, and the frequency response, and look for the result that gives the best results there. To achieve that, it's going to apply a couple of things. So there's going to be delay for each of the subwoofers. There's going to be, I'm going to call it local EQ. There's going to be per subwoofer EQ. This is really critical because this is the thing that you and I, for that matter, cannot do without these softwares because they're developed through this iterative process that can't be done manually. Because again, it's not like you would have to do what it's doing hundreds or thousands of times. It would take you forever, and it's doing it in a much more intelligent way than you or I could do. There is some lack of intelligence, which is where all of these softwares can run into problems. And that is that it can optimize something in a way that gives a very good result in one aspect, but a very, very bad result, like so bad you wouldn't want it in another aspect. So for any of you who have used MSO or Dirac for that matter and found that the results are not good, there absolutely are scenarios that will throw it for a loop. And I can't explain to you exactly what it is. So I think somebody could maybe look at the files and the stop conditions and say, oh, I see what it did. In trying to guess at what happened, it looks like it took an area of the frequency response. Like maybe it looked at the integration with the mains, it looked at the frequency response and the variance between seats, and it overweighted a certain area and certain variables over others. So like maybe it got to a point where there's just almost no variance between seats, and the integration is really good, but for some odd reason, it now has like a 20 dB peak at 20 hertz. And I don't know why it did that, but it did that. I've also had situations where it created a result where there's like a dead flat response almost everywhere. There's no variation between seats at all. There's a huge null where it integrates with the mains. And why it did that, I don't know. But what you can do is you go in, and with MSO, you can manually adjust this. With Dirac, you just got to take new measurements and try again. Like there isn't another solution, unfortunately. I think sound field management is the same. You just try again. There isn't really a lot of manual control there. I know Todd he developed it. So like Todd could. So if you had like a really major theater project where it was worth it for Harman to get more involved, and you had a problem that just things weren't working right, it wouldn't shock me if he could actually manually do it and fix whatever's getting goofed up in this particular result. But otherwise, it's kind of what you get, what you get. MSO has a lot of manual controls. In some ways, it's a little less refined than these other products, and in other ways, it's got so much more manual capabilities that if you understand what's going on and what's wrong, you can not just rerun it with new measurements, you can actually change those constraints and get better results. People do that a lot. But the point is that iterative brute force approach cannot be done manually. You have to do it through a piece of software like this. Dirac, my opinion is that Dirac basically makes this much easier for most people. MSO, all it does is that base optimization for multiple subs. It doesn't do any kind of room correction beyond what it's doing there. And I would argue that's actually one of the most important kinds of corrections to do, more important than the others. And so in and of itself, I think if somebody could use software like that and get good results, which you can use a mini DSP for, that's actually really, really good. But if you do want the extra benefit that Dirac Live has, Dirac Live with bass control is kind of like having MSO plus Dirac Live all together in one, in a package that's a lot easier to use for the average person who doesn't really have a lot of understanding of this. It's also baked into a lot of receivers. And so for the cost of the license, it's a relatively easy thing to implement. And the results that I've had with that are quite good. So I think bass control, as I said, is much more advanced than people realize. It is valuable. I have found good results with it. Not 100% of the time, it's not perfect, but more often than not, the results are very good. And often, one of the comments I made when I beta tested the PC software was I felt like it almost made me useless as a calibrator. Since then, I would walk that back a little bit, because since then I found enough goofy situations where I could do a far better job with some manual control. But I will say some of my manual calibrations might use MSO as a starting point, and then I go in and kind of fix things from there once I get a pretty good result from that, which isn't that far off then from doing what Dirac Live is doing. But I was getting results originally with the PC software that made me question why I would bother using my more manual approaches. But what really killed me was what might take me 3 or 4 hours manually was taking me like half an hour, 45 minutes with this software. And the end result was very comparable. Like if you overlaid them across, let's say, 3 positions, you would find that the 3 positions I measured at, which might, let's just say I did 4 measurements here, here, and here. So that's 12 measurements in total. And I did that for each of them. I made like a preset. One's a manual preset, one's a Dirac live with bass control preset. The manual one used, let's say, MSO plus PEQ for manually EQing up the rest of the response. Often Dirac live had some advantages. You may not like them, but as an example, it is making a correction in the time domain of the response. So the impulse response is being more optimized. So I couldn't do that manually. I mean, you really can't. It's a very difficult thing to do manually. The bass optimization was very similar to the MSO approach and often better than what I could get manually. And so ultimately, the end result of everything together was like really close to really good and achieved much more quickly. So I wrote an email actually to the person I was in contact with at the time that I was doing the testing and was just like, you've kind of made me unimportant. I still think you have to listen to it. Like when it comes to these calibrations, I'm not really unimportant. You do have to listen and then make sure that it's going to work out. But anyway, so that is my take on that. And so if you want to try to use the PC software, I think that's great. Give it a shot, see what you think. It can be a little clunky compared to having it built into a receiver, but it's not the end of the world. These systems still work pretty well. Like I said, the PC software actually has some advantages, which is nice. And then the other thing I'll mention is that you don't necessarily have to use a fancy 4-channel DAC. A USB audio interface works fine. That's what I've always used. I have a Mo2 M6. I have a RME Babyface. I've got another, I forget what the model is now, 828 ES maybe from Mo2 and a couple other interfaces. And they all work really well for something like this and often have enough channels you can do all sorts of crazy things. So yeah, give it a shot. See what you think. See if the results are good. The free trial lets you try it for free. So why not? The biggest disappointment I've ever had, and I don't have a good explanation for this other than maybe there's bugs on how it gets implemented, is that I have found sometimes that I can get like really good results on the PC software. And then I go and try to mimic that with a receiver and I don't get the same result, even though I'm using what should be the same software and correction, including I'm using the same basic. It is a different software, but I'm using the basic. It's the same thing. It's like on my computer, I've got one is the one that sends the filter out to the unit. The other one is the one that just creates the filter for the player itself and then uses it. And I get like this really great looking result on the computer. And then I use the one that sends it off to the receiver and I don't get such a great result. Even though the mic positions, or even in one case, I remember the measurements themselves were the identical measurements. Like the file that went into one is what was sent to the other. Each one then iterated its result and created something that one went to a player on the receiver, went to a player on the computer to use, and then everything got passed through that player. And then it's not a player actually, it's forgetting my word right now, not an emulator. Anyway, not important. I should know what this is though. The other one went off to the receiver and went into that, and the results were not the same. My guess, and I've long suspected that this is true, is that there may be glitches or bugs or something in some receivers and processors in their implementation of Dirac that's actually creating problems, so that what comes out is not really what went in. Often this is completely out of Dirac's control because all they're really supplying is a license and a computer software that generates the filters. Those then go to the receiver or the processor, and it's really up to the receiver or processor manufacturer to implement that correctly. Dirac could tell you better, and I actually owe them a call at some point soon. They sent me an email about having a conversation, but there might be some sort of a certification before they do this. There might not be. I mean, it might be as simple as they make sure that they've implemented the capability, but not actually confirm that it works as intended. That might ultimately be up to the QC of the manufacturer, which, as we know, is not always great. All right. Anyway, I've gone on long enough on this one. So I hope this was helpful. The donations are really helpful. I'll do another video on the hurricane, but I'm in really good shape. Our issues are minor. I'll talk more about it for those that are curious, but there's a lot of people that have it way worse than I do. So I would feel bad even complaining at all. But we do have damage. It is in dollar terms quite a lot of damage, but it's not devastating. It's a lot because I have to pay out of pocket. It's not going to get covered by insurance because it would have to exceed 17,000 some odd dollars to get covered by the insurance. And you don't want to cover things with insurance if you don't have to. And so anyway, we're kind of stuck doing this ourselves, but it is what it is. So thanks for watching. Got more videos coming. Like these videos, subscribe to the channel, and the donations are great. Thanks again.